Yo, everybody. Welcome to this week's edition of Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast that digs into the world of comic books. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is a great one. Comics retailer Brian Hibbs returns to the show to discuss the current state of comics retail, how his shops are doing, Marvel and DC's tough times, and more. But before we get into this week's chat, don't forget to subscribe to Off Panel on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And hey, make sure to rate and review Off Panel as well. It helps the show in the magical world of algorithms and the internets. And if you're a super fan of the show, you can back it on Patreon as well at patreon.com/offpanel. In exchange for your support, you'll get early access to each week's show, exclusive access to written and audio content, and more. And now, let's get to this week's episode. Yo, everybody. I'm here with a return visitor to the show. He's the owner of the San Francisco comic shop's Comics Experience and Comics Experience Outpost, as well as the writer of Tilting at Windmills, a regular column at The Beat. It's Brian Hibbs. Thanks for coming on, Brian.
Thanks for having me, David.
So we're doing another one of our little yearly check-ins on seeing how your shops are doing, see how comics retail is doing. So I want to start there. It seems like 2018 has been maybe like a stabilizing year, or at least from the outside. How has it been for your shops?
Things are weird here in San Francisco. Things are always weird in San Francisco, but I think things are especially weird here in San Francisco. We've got, the national issues with our current president, which I think has got a lot of Democrats hoarding their nuts as opposed to spending. And so, that's an impact. And then San Francisco is just really weird in terms of housing policy and like the way that we treat millionaires. And it's just not a friendly city anymore if you're not really, really stinking rich, which in turn, kind of drives the local economy down, in my opinion, at least down at my level. So business has been meh. But I mean, I've been through this. It'll be 30 years come April, so I know how to get through the downturns. I know where to stave the pennies, and I know what to do and how to work around it. So we're doing fine, but business is definitely way down.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel like that's more associated with your market, or do you feel like that's more of a blanket thing, or do you have a feel for that?
No. I think in this particular case, it's the local deal is a significant part of it. I mean, I do think that the comics industry is transitioning from one thing to another.
Right.
And I think that that's hard for those of us who've been doing it for 30 years in some cases, because we've got to refigure out how things work. But I know certainly at the main store, the periodical market is just a middling thing at this point. I mean, it's not even that it's a middling thing. There's still plenty of life in it. It's just that the publishers, stop me if you heard this one before, are just, they're fucking with the customers. And, the fact that, it seems like there's a nonstop weekly series now going on, and they're all like 4 and 5 issue miniseries. It's absurd, like people don't know how to buy these comics. People don't want to buy comics that way.
Right.
I don't need, as I've said 100 times before, I don't need more comics I'm going to sell 5 or 6 copies of. It's the last thing that I need. It's the last thing any store needs as far as I'm concerned. I need books that I'm going to sell 40 and 50 copies of, and those are few and far between today.
Yeah. I mean, especially with Saga on hiatus. I know that was one of, if not the biggest seller you had. And so
it is my biggest seller. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, like having that bullet out of your gun is a pretty big deal. But I did want to set up a little bit.
And actually, let me follow on that though. Let me follow on that real briefly. So not only is not having that bullet in my gun a pretty big deal, but it's one of those books that sells phenomenally well to civilians, muggles, whatever you want to call them. And so therefore, much like Sandman was 15, 20 years ago, it was a book that was bringing people in who otherwise would not walk into a comic shop, and who would then be open to buying other things if you could sell to them properly, right? So the loss of Saga isn't merely that we're losing our number one periodical comic, which we are, which is and it's our number one periodical comic by this huge measure. So it's actually like we're losing, like the equivalent of our telephone bill every month in sales, which is significant. I mean, that's huge. But we're also losing the opportunity to then, sell other things to those people. And I really think that the notion of a 1-year hiatus is, I wonder how many people are going to come back in a year. I wonder if they'll hear about it. I wonder if they'll remember it. They might, but his history says that it's not good for comics. And then the last point that I want to make with that is, I was deeply frustrated that we got no warning. That literally we found out the same way that the fans found out, by opening up the letters column and reading it there. And not that they owe us anything, because they don't, but if I knew that Saga would end eventually, and I thought that we would have a 6 or 9 month, amount of warning to figure out what to do and try to make a plan and instigate that plan. And just to have it disappear on us like that it's bad juju as far as I'm concerned.
It's kind of funny. It sounds like it's, I talk to retailers and they say that, like, especially Marvel, but Marvel and DC are really important because not only do they sell a lot, but they also bring people into their stores to, like, potentially buy other things. And it sounds like Saga does much the same. It's like, I'm not saying Image doesn't do that, but it seems like Saga is almost like the third pillar of that hierarchy, in that they can bring other people in. But do you have a sense as to, like, what the impact? This is just a curiosity thing, but do you have a sense to whether or not people who came in just for Saga, those civilians or muggles, whatever you want to call them, whether or not they've gotten into other comics? Like, is that a common thing?
I mean, we've been able to sell them things here and there, but it was always Saga that was the thing that was driving them into the store.
Sure.
Right? So the question is how much. It's pretty easy to hand a Saga reader, say, a Monstrous, right?
Right.
They like that book. They like Blackbird. They like X, Y, or Z. But are they driven to come back in for that title the way that they were driven to come in for Saga?
Right.
And that's an open question. And it's going to be an open question for a bit yet, because it's one of those things that was that, and again, I use Sandman very specifically, because that was the other book that kind of built this store. Those were books that were drawing in people who would never ever have come in otherwise, and it were important books as a result of that.
It is somewhat funny that Sandman came back right as Saga was ending. I mean, not that this is going to be the same version of Sandman. How is this version of Sandman doing for you?
It's doing okay. I mean, it's not. We're certainly not seeing, hundreds of people who used to read Sandman back in the day come rushing in looking for it.
Right.
Because at the least they haven't heard of it. Nobody told them about it.
Right.
It's a different world right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm of two. I want to talk about the Saga gap really quick, just because I'm of two minds as to what that's going to do. On one hand, I think there's the possibility that the fact that, we can't remember things that happened 2 weeks ago because there's so much news at this point. So it's hard to remember, this comic I read is coming back or something like that. But on the other hand, there's part of me that feels like part of the reason why Saga was as big of a hit as it was is because Brian K. Vaughan disappeared from the scene for so long. And then when he reappeared, it was like there was anticipation for his return with Saga. I don't know if that would actually work, but I don't know. I have no feel for how it's going to work, but I feel like it could end up being a good thing. And I mean, upon its return, that people won't disappear, but we'll see.
Yeah, no, we will see. I mean, the risk comes in because we're buying non-returnable, right?
Right.
And currently it's my number one selling book, you know, and not by a little, by like double or triple the next book. So, you know, and yeah, I mean, you know, we are talking about only having a 1 month window, but I am really leery about ordering 150 copies of it when it returns at this moment in time. You know, and not assuming that a third of the audience has wandered away, you know, because that becomes actual risk,
right?
And not just, you know, oh, I'm deciding between 5 copies and 6 copies, you know, which is risk, but it's not risk in the way that deciding between 150 and 100 copies is.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's tough to order 54 or 55 at 54 levels because you don't know whether that audience is going to be there. And I think that's a thing that people often forget because of the non-returnability. But I do want to set things up a little bit for you because for listeners that don't know, Brian has 2 shops, Comics Experience and Comics Experience Outpost. Comics Experience, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, Comics Experience is the flagship store, the one that's turning 30 in April, and it's primarily book, graphic novel driven, and periodicals are more of a secondary thing. Comics Experience Outpost is a shop that you acquired more recently, and it's a shop that's more monthly periodical driven, and you've been kind of trying to transition it over so it's a little bit more, or not, you're not trying to move it towards Comics Experience, but you've been trying to cultivate it into your own shop, and it's been slow to take. How are you seeing different? I mean, I think one of the interesting things about you is the fact that you can kind of see 2 different flavors of where the comic industry could go just with your shops. Like, are you having significantly different years in 2018 with those shops?
No. And that was why, you know, you asked earlier, do I think it's a regional thing or do I think it's the industry? And that I think it's a regional thing because both stores are down by about the same amount in the same environment. But you know, they operate in very different fashions, and the things that they need to drive them are different. You know, periodicals are fundamentally different in the way you stock them and think about them and react to them than books are. And you know, it becomes kind of inherently riskier the more you know, Marvel and DC, especially Marvel, but Marvel and DC are playing more and more games with varying covers and weekly series and things that cross over and not explaining them properly. You know, and things, I mean, the frustrating thing for me as a retailer, especially one with a lot of experience in this, is how much the rules have changed in the last year or two. Things that you would never do or we just understood to be true are no longer true. As an example, last week's comics had the beginning of a Drowned Earth crossover between Justice League and Aquaman. And it, you know, and they're identified as such on our invoice even, right? You know, they're solicited as this is a Drowned crossing over, right? Mm-hmm. Aquaman had something on the cover. Justice League didn't bother to put anything on the cover about it. And I know that sounds really minor, but that's the kind of bedrock assumption that no publisher would ever do that 2 years ago, you know? And now DC doesn't seem to care as far as I can tell. That's overstating it, I'm sure, but there's just a thing like that over and over and over again that's like, well, why am I going out on a limb for you then? Why am I ordering extra copies of these books if you can't even bother to identify them on the cover for the consumer? How do you think people discovered this stuff? Anyway, I could rant, and I don't want to rant.
No, I mean,
no good.
I do have to say I'm with you on that because you know, whenever they have those crossovers, that the cover part is the connective tissue. And like, I read a lot on the internet about comics, so I'm going to be somebody who knows these things. But even if I go in and I don't see that on there, it's going to confuse me. I have an entirely different pet peeve with the crossovers. Like, I was really liking Justice League Dark, and it really bothered me that they, within the 3 issues, they had jumped into a crossover with Wonder Woman. And it makes narrative sense, but at the same time, it's just like, it was one of those things that bothers me because it's like that's kind of like a Marvel thing. And I hate to be petty, but it is a Marvel thing to jump into an event so fast, or a crossover. and it kind of chased me away. I'll probably jump back in on issue 5 or whatever it is when Justice League Dark is back to doing that, but I don't want to start buying Wonder Woman and these like bookend titles for $4.99 each because they decided to do a crossover randomly. But
I agree, and then you add sort of the insult to the injury that both Justice League and Justice League Dark shipped the same week.
Right.
So if you're a Justice League reader and your plan was I'm getting a Justice League title a week, you don't now. It's little stuff that each individual one is maybe not so bad, but you start adding it all together, and it makes it, I think, very difficult to be a periodical reader in the current market. And the thing is especially at the big store, at the flagship store, what I'm seeing is less and less and less and less and less and less people care about superhero stuff, except in some sort of abstract kind of, oh, you have Batman, you have Deadpool, but they're not looking for anything in particular necessarily. And all of the action happening now is in kids' books, is in nonfiction, is in places that we never really served particularly well as a marketplace, and it's roaring in. I mean, kids' books are. I can't even express to you how much we're selling in kids' books compared to the superhero stuff at this point. It stuns me sometimes when I take a step back and look at it.
So are you selling? I mean, are you speaking about in graphic novels or in everything?
Yeah, no, in graphic novels.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, kids periodicals sell fine too, but it's graphic novels that I'm talking about here.
I just wasn't sure if you were saying kids graphic novels sell more than superheroes with like graphic novels and single issues combined.
They for sure do. Like the new Dogman, right? Like I've sold, I don't know, I think 15, 20 copies of that in the last 3 weeks. And I mean, that's not even particularly good comics. You know what I mean?
Right.
And I can't think of a superhero graphic novel that sells more than 3 or 4 copies a month. Watchmen, sells 3 or 4 copies a month. Dogman sells 15 copies a month. You tell me, man.
And the problem is Watchmen came out like around when the shop opened.
Okay.
No, I know, but I mean, like, that's
but
funny.
But it's my bestseller, is my point. It's the best-selling superhero comic, and it doesn't. I mean, it sells fine. It sells actually. I should really say that is selling very well, because that means you're selling 30 or 40 a year.
Right.
And that's a great fucking number for a book. I think we've discussed this before, David, that like a lot of people don't really understand how poorly most books turn.
Well, but what I was saying though with Watchmen though is like, I feel like it's great that Watchmen sells a lot, but it is kind of funny that a comic that came out like in the 80s is still the best-selling graphic novel that we have in terms of superhero stuff. I think it kind of speaks to how little that the superhero stuff has looked at graphic novels. But I do want to comment, like our comic shops have had a cornucopia of options in the last month in terms of kids books, because you've had a new Amulet, you had the Dogman book, you had Faith Erin Hicks had a new book with the final book from the Nameless City, The Divided Earth. I mean, there's like it's been a really like strong like third, fourth quarter-ish for kids books in 2019. I mean, we're gonna have a double Telgemeier, as I've been calling it, and that's really promising. So I'm not surprised that that's happening, but I'm kind of surprised it's happening in your store, because I kind of always thought of your store as more like, I don't want to say adult oriented, but it's like you have like maybe an older audience, but maybe I'm wrong about that.
No. I mean, we're the prototypical Vertigo store,
right?
So yes, no. I mean, our association has always been that we're a sophisticated store for sophisticated readers, as it were. But the thing is that kids comics are becoming sophisticated, and kids themselves are becoming sophisticated readers of comics.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of this, for us, I know that we're probably significantly ahead of the curve from most of our peers because of the graphic novel clubs, right? And the kids graphic novel club is growing at a faster pace than the adult one. Because there's a lot of parents out there who realize that, oh my God, my kids are reading and loving it.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to inculcate that in my kids, and so because we have the two clubs, we're constantly having a flow of kids through here, and and then they're buying other things as well. They're not just buying the one book, which is kind of nice and refreshing to see. And they're telling their friends, and we're seeing new kids all the time. Every day I'm telling people about the clubs, and they're like, that's the greatest idea I've ever heard, So yeah, I mean, I think that there's still a lot of growth that can be done there with the kids space. And here's the thing that fundamentally makes me feel confident about the long run of comics is that if kids comics are as good as they are today, and the kids are as passionate about them as they are today, in 10 years, when those kids grow up and become adult comic readers, that bodes nothing but well for comics.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like the last boom that we had, which was the manga boom, which didn't really yield a lot of adults reading comics, because there's not a lot of adult manga, especially, that's getting translated and brought into the States.
Mm-hmm.
And the kids who were reading only manga don't necessarily then move over to a Saga or to a Monstrous or whatever, because they're not manga like, especially. Whereas kids comics, you like you say, you have the full range. Faith Erin Hicks and Arena, really don't have a lot of connective tissue to one another, other than the fact that they're both excellent cartoonists, right? But there's not that style thing that manga put on it.
Right. I want to ask, actually, I read something last night that just was astoundingly good. How did Tilly Walden's On a Sunbeam do for you? I know that's kind of like I don't even know what age group I would even call that, but it was a really good book, and it was first, second, so I'm curious if it did well for you.
Yeah, no, it did well. We've already sold out, and I've got more copies coming, and I think it's going to continue to turn. We did Spinning as one of our graphic novel club picks last year, and so I think we exposed a whole lot of people to her. And yeah, she's a talent to watch, I think, for sure.
So young, unbelievable.
Yep.
Yo, everybody. I want to take a quick break to talk about my friends at Radio vs. the Martians. Mike Gillis and Casey Doran host the Radio vs. the Martians podcast, a show that gathers their funniest, smartest friends once a month for a deep dive into science fiction, video games, horror, comics, movies, and everything in between. So far, they've dissected topics like Superman, Steven Spielberg, Akira, George Lucas, zombies, Twin Peaks, Hayao Miyazaki, James Bond, Watchmen, and whether drivers are required to pull over for the Ghostbusters. Find this podcast and its spin-off show, Podcast La Vista, baby, a celebration of the films of thespian and statesman Arnold Schwarzenegger on iTunes, Stitcher, and RadioVersusTheMartians.com. And now, back to the show. Yeah, no, it is really interesting, and I think one thing that I really like about the kids' books is it does seem like there's almost a funnel leading up, because there are good young readers books, and then there's kind of middle age readers, and then there's young adult books. It'll be interesting to see how they try to transition to the adult stuff. But I did want to ask, how do you feel that? Do you have any sense as to how you might order or you might look at DC Ink and Zoom and how that would fit in all this? Because I do like that move. I just don't know how the execution is going to be.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, it literally depends on what books come out in what order and how they position it. And, so there's a lot of open questions there. I'm looking forward to, I mean, you said that there's a healthy ecosystem with YA and stuff. I think I would disagree a little bit. I think we're pretty thin on the actual readable good YA. I mean, there's stuff being published ostensibly for that audience, but I don't think that the majority of it is particularly compelling work.
Sure.
So if DC can help crack that nut, that might help. The thing is I don't really think that a lot of those readers are looking to be put into the superhero ecosystem, right? I don't think they're necessarily opposed to it. Certainly, Superhero Girls sells very, 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 very well. DC Superhero Girls. Mm-hmm. But I'm not necessarily convinced that audience is looking for 10 more licks of ice cream that are basically the same flavor.
Right.
You know?
It's not necessarily a natural transition from like Mara, a book about Mara, to like The Prince and the Dressmaker or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. I would actually, I'd put it the other way around, but yeah. And I think that is, I think that it's a good thing that they're attempting it, but I just feel that it's more about brand management, maybe perceptually,
sure,
than necessarily about producing good comics that will keep people coming back for more.
I do have to say I really like the covers, and a lot of the creators they have on there is interesting. It seems like it's very much aimed at the book market, especially looking at the covers. But I'll be real. That's one thing I'm going to be really interested to see how it does. Not that I'll be able to really see any like. It'll be a real feel-based thing as far as how performance goes. But I did want to ask specifically about DC because I saw you in February in Portland at Comics Pro, and I could describe the tenor of the room in terms of how people were talking about DC as extremely positive. I mean, like John Cunningham was there. People were like speaking about, were very fond of his speech and how he was talking about everybody's partners. But it seems like since then that DC is about, like, retailers are about as down on DC as they've been since I can really even remember. Like, how do you feel? Like, has that improved at all, or is that still pretty not great?
I mean, I feel like right now there's this huge communication gap and a huge, maybe a policy gap might be the, So look, so DC for 20 years, more maybe, really made an effort to be retailers' best friends, to really bend over backwards, be retailer friendly, to have policies that made sense for retailers. I'm talking about things like returnability, there's a whole list of things that are probably the nuts and bolts of it are very boring to the average person in your audience. And one could argue that they were doing all this stuff, and yet it didn't necessarily translate into market share for them necessarily. I think it did. I think that their market share would be significantly worse if they hadn't done a lot of the things that they did. But, that's not a thing you can really prove one way or the other. And I think that on a corporate level, it appears to me like they were given a set of marching orders now that they need to get a lot closer to what Marvel's doing. And so they're following some of that playbook. And I think that they're having some measure of commercial success following that playbook, but that doesn't endear them to us because every retailer I know fucking despises Marvel.
Right.
And the way that they do business. And I'm not trying to be flip about that. I mean, I'm really serious. I don't know a retailer who likes the way that Marvel does business, that is comfortable with it, that feels that it's maximizing our profitability. They're just trying to maximize the money that they get from the consumer. Mm-hmm. And so we're seeing more of that happening with DC, and then we see things like the Walmart fiasco, which I can't tell you how disheartening it is for them to take their two biggest commercial names, Bendis and Tom King, put them on material that people want to see. Like, Bendis on Batman is the only thing that people want to see from Bendis at DC. Do you know?
Yeah, and with Nick Darrington, I do want to say Nick Darrington is tremendous, but not that he's as big.
No, absolutely. But then to have it, and so okay, this material is now only available at Walmart. It literally doesn't make sense. Why? Who at Walmart knows at all who Brian Michael Bendis is, or Tom King for that matter? Who? There's no customer shopping at Walmart who knows that. I mean, not really. And if they are, they're direct market customers, And so it seems really like a calculated attempt to get our customers to move channels. by not giving us access to that same material. Like a blatantly calculated attempt.
Would you have an issue with these Walmart giants if they were just reprints? If they didn't have Tom King and Brian Bendis in there?
No, I wouldn't. No.
Okay.
Because the direct market doesn't particularly want that, and I think it's a fantastic idea to serialize something like Hush, which is 15 years old,
right?
And to try and turn people onto comics like that. That's a fantastic idea. But to take brand new material and put it cross-channel to an audience that cannot possibly know what that material is or what the significance of it is or why they would want it, it just seems like you're trying to fuck with us, you know?
Yeah.
At the same time, you know, we've got things like the Batman. I can't remember the goddamn subtitle now. Thank you, Damned.
Yeah.
Fiasco, which was, you know, really badly handled. I think I understand the motivation for what happened, but you don't in a market that is a collectible based market, which comics still fucking is, and everyone knows this.
Right.
And especially if you come out of consumer products, you should really have a really clear view of how this kind of a market works. To then go, we're not going to reprint this. In fact, we may never reprint it in an uncensored format, and in fact, we may never even do the rest of the comics. We may just do a book.
Mm-hmm.
I just that it created this feeding frenzy, this speculation frenzy, which was gross.
Right.
And didn't need to have happened at all. It could have been handled in a very different way. And at the same time, all of these things are happening. DC suddenly, almost overnight, shut down their Facebook group.
Yeah.
And shut down any kind of commentary and any kind of communication of any kind to retailers. And you're just kind of, as a store, you're looking at it from the distance and going, 1, 2, 3 strikes. What's up, dude? You're out, you know? And it's not as it would be one thing if the DC line was succeeding across the board, but it's not. Their mid-list is as much of a shambles as Marvel's mid-list is, and some of their high-profile stuff, you know, which they seem to have banked the farm on, such as Bendis' Superman or Heroes in Crisis, is being, you know, received in a very, very, very lukewarm way from the audience. So you add all these things together, and it's kind of hard not to be down on DC. And you know, they've got to get their communication together to get us back in their corner, I think. And I don't know when and if that's going to happen.
Not sure if shutting down comments in the Facebook group is the way to go about it.
No.
I do want to say that, you know, we were talking earlier about with Saga, and I was saying about how, like, you know, we forget about things that happened like 2 weeks ago. It is kind of funny that you went through all of that, and like I feel like the big first chink in their armor was Batman number 50 and everything that happened with that.
Oh, and, sure, yes, true, absolutely. I just didn't want to make it a 40-minute run, you know.
No, I understand. Right? Yeah. No, I mean, I think that all the weird thing is
no,
like
that was straight up fucked up.
Yeah.
That was not ha ha ha. That's cute. That was, you literally lied to us.
Right.
The solicitation specifically said there was a wedding.
Right. I mean, I heard I remember, actually, this is sad that I remember this, but I remember where I was when I found out that this was happening. I was going off to have breakfast, and I got all these messages on Twitter being like, "Are you seeing this?" I'm like, "What?" And I like looked at it, and it was just kind of astounding because the whole Batman wedding thing, there were shops that were ordering wedding cakes. There were shops that were actually having weddings in their stores because this was such a big deal. And like the amazing thing is like from a PR standpoint, because I work in, you know, PR and marketing, and it astounded me. It was like they had everybody with this amazing thing. This was their carrot. Batman and Catwoman were getting married, and then like a few days beforehand, they're like, we really need to seal the deal. Let's tell everyone that they're not getting married. And I'm like, that is the worst PR marketing move I've ever seen in comics, and it's kind of astonishing. But
the thing that's not clear to me is if the marketing people actually thought the wedding was going to go through or not. It looks like it from the way they marketed to us. And, again, in that Facebook group, they were in there going, no, this is a big deal. You guys really need to get in on this. Have you gotten your exclusive cover yet? Like they were pushing it. This was not a light thing that they were doing. And so I don't know if editorial just gave them the wrong information or not. I mean, I would like to believe that, just from a benefit of the doubt point of view. But if so, then that speaks to internal problems that are crazy bad, and so to straight up lie to us. I mean, they didn't use weasel words, right? Like retailers know how to read solicitations, we understand that if you put a may in there or a could, like that means it's not happening, right? We get that, right? Like we understand how you need to present one thing to the consumer at the same time presenting something different to us. But this solicitation copy was straight up, all of their friends are there for the wedding of the century, and you read the comic book and like all of their friends, there's literally nobody in this comic other than Batman and Commissioner Gordon,
Yeah. Looking at all this stuff on the whole, it is really like one of the weird things about a lot of what the things that DC has done this year is you could look at a lot of it as things that have stoked the flames of the speculator market. And it's a very strange thing because like even the Walmart giants, like a lot of I remember going on eBay, just being curious, and there was a lot of giants on eBay. And then like Batman Damned, holy crap. There was like 657 different auctions selling variations of Batman Damned. And I know you were saying earlier about how DC seems to have taken on some of Marvel's approaches. And I don't know I don't know if they've been doing order gates or if they've been doing anything like that, but it does seem like they've been doing a lot of like the more short-sighted things that Marvel is often guilty of. And it is I will say, like, qualitatively, I very much have enjoyed Marvel's fresh start. I think that it's a lot of the comics are a lot better than they have been in a long time. However, it does, like, all these practices make it very hard to want to continue on with a lot of other things. Like, look at Uncanny X-Men #1 that's coming out in a few weeks, and it has something like 23 covers, and it's $7.99. And if I were, and it's going to be a weekly, so it's like the royal flush of like nightmare scenarios for retailers. And for me as a reader, I don't even know if I'm going to buy it. And I am like, X-Men is my jam. And it's a really fascinating
I'll tell you,
scenario.
there's even a thread on some of the Facebook message groups where retailers are actively questioning if after this 10-issue storyline ends, if there's going to be a number 11.
Oh, I don't think so, honestly.
Right? Yeah, I mean, none of us do either.
Mm-hmm.
We feel like it's part of the endless cycle of keep doing new number ones, keep pushing that, and that it works less and less and less and less and less every time. I mean, we're at the point where I looked at Uncanny and I went, no, I'm not. I can't buy into this. I'm not. If it wasn't an $8 weekly comic, I probably would have ordered 50, 60, 70 copies of The Return of Uncanny X-Men. I went 25 on this one. And I'm like, if I sell out, oh fucking well.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like there's people clamoring anyway because, there's so many X-Men comics. Who knows what it is? Who knows where the through line is anymore? It's crazily frustrating.
Yeah.
Crazily frustrating. And yeah, there's a whole lot of stuff that is designed from both companies to appeal to the speculators. Should I actually say the arbitrators? Because they're not speculators. Speculators are the guys who bought 100 copies of Wolverine #1 back in the day.
Right.
Because they knew that 15 years later they were going to be able to get $30 and $40 and $50 for that 75-cent comic book.
Right.
That's speculation. When you buy something to hold on to it for a while
Right.
let it mature, and then sell it later, right? This is not what's happening today. These are flippers. These are people who are buying a comic on Tuesday so they can sell it by Thursday at the latest. Right. And that is a fundamentally different way of selling comics. It's a fundamentally different way of approaching ordering them. And it breaks comics in more ways than I want to say, because you have websites that literally are like, here's the comics you should all go flip this week.
Right.
And people are running in and trying to grab up all those comics, and then they're off the market. So because the print runs are now so low, you actually can manipulate comics like that.
Yeah.
It's entirely possible for one guy to go around an entire city, unless it's maybe New York or Los Angeles, in Chicago, I guess, and buy up every single copy. I think that if you tried to corner the market on Uncanny X-Men #1 when it's released in San Francisco, you could probably do it for less than $500.
Yeah.
Buy literally every copy that's in the city of San Francisco for that amount of money.
Yeah. If I tried to corner the market in Anchorage, it would just be a depressing and expensive operation that wouldn't bode much for me. But it is interesting how that stuff works. I mean, the $7.99 thing, I do want to say, like, is kind of, I'm not really price sensitive for the most part, but it annoys me when I see things like Batman Damned #1. I might have bought that. I was excited about Black Label, but it being $6.99 was a turnoff, even if it was slightly bigger. But one thing I wanted to say about that in terms of the art.
Yeah, but you could have sold it for $90.
I thought about it, but I couldn't do it. I would have felt dirty. I wouldn't have liked it. But I was talking to a retailer buddy of mine, and he was talking about how excited he was that he sold like all of the Batman Damned copies. And I was like, is it speculators or like, arbitrators? And he said yes. He thought it probably was. And I'm like, how do you order #2 if #2 comes because of that? Because the people who want to especially since we know that #2 is going to be censored. Whatever they do with it, it's not gonna have any more Bat Dick in it. So who wants it? I mean, other than the people who couldn't get issue #1, and they literally can't get issue #1 now. Because there's no second printing. There's not even a censored second printing. It's just such a stupid fucking way to launch your line, and I don't know. I am genuinely surprised that no one has been fired. Right.
Genuinely surprised.
The thing about Black Label that really astonishes me is like you read the hubbub about how like maybe it's DOA already. And like I don't know what they were expecting if they were launching a mature readers line with Brian Azzarello and Lee Bermejo. I mean, like, what did they think they were going to get? Like Batman hugging the Joker or something?
And here's the other thing. There is zero chance that every single person in DC editorial and at least one president, VP level person at Warner Brothers didn't know about this fully ahead of time.
Right. Yeah, it was very odd.
This is not a surprise to anybody. There was no, oh my God, his penis is there. I mean, it was a surprise to the new incoming person, right? Because she hadn't signed off on that. Mm-hmm. Pam Lifford, I think is her name.
Yep.
But there is literally a 0% chance that there was not someone at Warner Brothers who signed off on this. Because they're a conservative company in the first place. Mm-hmm. There's no way that Dan DiDio didn't know absolutely everything about this thing and take it to someone and go, is this cool? And someone went, yeah, that's cool. Mm-hmm. Because why shouldn't it be cool? What the fuck is the problem? You're not going to sell fewer toys, right? You're literally not going to sell one less action figure because some comic has an outline of his penis.
Right. I'm just sad that Wizard Magazine doesn't exist anymore, because otherwise we could have #1, Batman's penis. We could have a first appearance in there, but now we can't. But I want to transit.
Well, Wizard Magazine does exist, though. It exists now in these free magazines that Marvel and DC are trying to compete with each other on.
That is true.
They're literally like, why can't we just get rid of this in-house thing and have it be something that people can sell rather than I just don't understand it. I don't understand what anyone's thinking there at either of those companies. I don't think that they know what they're doing. Mm-hmm. And I don't mean that. I literally, I hope you heard the tone of my voice there. I don't mean that in an insulting way. I just think that this market is fucking screwy right now, and I think that people are doing anything to keep their jobs. You know, even if it means that 3 years from now they fuck their job beyond belief.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but in the meantime, us in the trenches, I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing anymore. And when I see that fewer and fewer and fewer people actually give a shit about the superhero stuff, specifically because they get it hundreds of hours of it into their home for free or in effect free.
Right.
You know? You know, there's 20 hours of superhero television on television every week.
Yeah.
It feels like some weeks, you know, that's insane.
Yeah. I mean, I can turn on TV anytime and find probably a show or like an MCU movie or like a DC movie just anytime. But I do feel like it's worth noting that, like, for listeners that don't know, I mean, retailers, you're not saying this because you're just like spanking them or something like that. Like Marvel and DC, like you fundamentally want them to succeed because their success means your success. It's just, I don't know. I mean, it is just interesting to see it because like a lot of the decisions are not being made for long-term growth or long-term gains. It's really just like a lot of short-term based decisions. But I do have to ask before we move on.
But those short-term decisions ultimately harm the long term of their business.
Of course.
That's the real important part to take away from that. And it didn't for years, right? They made a lot of short-term decisions for many years that the market rolled with, but it's now starting to catch up to us. It's like a smoker, right? Mm-hmm. You know, you can smoke for 5 or 10 years and there's not any visible thing, but then all of a sudden you've got that cough and that hacking wheeze and you can't breathe, and then what do you do?
Right.
You know?
I do want to bring up the third pillar really quick because one line that you threw out in one of your Tilting at Windmills really struck me, and you described Image as throwing stuff against the wall and seeing what sticks. I've had that thought for a while. I actually wrote about it in my Patreon recently. It seems like, in September, they actually released as many comic books as DC did. And that's a lot. That's an astounding amount for Image. Like, what do you think is happening there? Is it just them trying to figure things out or what?
Well, I think, you know, the most charitable view is that Image has a creative pipeline because it's creator-owned that is probably considerably longer than a lot of the company-owned material for Marvel and DC. In other words, that it may well be that comics that are coming out now are things that they signed the first contract for 3 years ago. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean?
Right.
Right? Because people don't necessarily produce quickly or efficiently, or, you know, and Image has always been the company that, as far as I know, has always been take your time, get it right, do whatever, you know. And so, you know, it's entirely possible that purchasing decisions that were made, you know, at some point in the past that don't make any sense any longer, but they still have to go along with them. Okay, so that's the terrible view. The less charitable view is that Image pays its rent and pays its salary, Image Central, from a fee from, you know, it's essentially vanity publishing at the end of the day. I mean, if it was a book publisher, everybody would think that Image was a bad thing and not a good thing. It's only in comics that we think it's a good thing because of the history of comics, right? But, you know, they make their money by charging everybody that $X fee, you know, and then the percentage that comes after. So in order to, you know, they just up and moved to Portland not too long ago. I think they added a couple of staff members. You know, those things cost money, and the only way they can have that money is to continue to do it is, and I'm not calling this a bad thing, right? But it's to publish more comics,
right?
You know, and I think that we look at Image and we can go, okay, in the 15-year history, is that right? 15,
25.
15? 25.
Yeah.
I knew it was just an anniversary. But in that 25 years, there are, taking out the early speculator wizard
right.
part of Image, right, where they were selling 1 million copies of every comic book. But since then, I think that we can go. They've had 2 hits in that time. You know,
2
they've
monster
had Walking
hits.
Dead and they've had Saga, and that's pretty much it. There's a couple other things that are minor hits, you know, but they've had 2 big books in all of that time. And so the only way you can find those books is just literally throwing as much shit at the wall and seeing, will this one work? Will this one work? Will this one work? You know, but the problem is they don't have the bandwidth or the staff or the engagement to promote those books properly and to let people know that they're out there and to actually sell the comics, leaving it instead to the retailers, which is not necessarily horrible, but I can't sell a brand new Image #1 every single week of my life.
Yeah.
Let alone some weeks where we get 3 or 4 of them. You know, I don't have the bandwidth to do that. It's not possible. And there's other publishers in the world beyond just Image. You know, so while I, as a retailer, kind of fundamentally believe in Image more than I believe in any other publisher because of the creator ownership, because of the creator freedom, because of the creator control. Those are all things that are in my best interest as a retailer. But, you know, the sheer flood of it and the lack of support that any of it has makes it extraordinarily problematic for us to get involved or to take any kind of position on their books.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the things. I'm of 2 minds about this. Like, on one hand, I appreciate the fact that they're publishing more in different types of comics from more and different types of creators. Those are both good things. However, the problem is like, I always kind of come back to the fact that for every customer and every retailer, to a certain degree, there is an opportunity cost there. And for me, I used to buy almost every Image #1 at the very least to see if I like it enough to continue in trade or to continue in singles. And those, I can't do that anymore. Like, if I did do that, like, I couldn't handle it. There's just too many of them. And so it's like, I'm having to make decisions before that I didn't in the past. And it's a really interesting place to be, because I always thought that more comics would be a good thing. But then it started to become
no. Less is always more.
Right.
Less is more, and you know, particularly in the environment that we live in, where everything has so much. You know, you're asking people to make decisions that they're not interested in making, they're not able to make, and you know what? Shit's coming into their house again, essentially for free on their Netflix. You know. I mean, yes, you're paying whatever it is, $15, $20 a month for Netflix, but nobody thinks of it that way, right? You don't think, oh, I'm paying $20 to watch this show. No, you think that I'm getting all these things for free. You know?
Yeah, I never think about it, to be honest.
Yeah, so you know, I think I think bandwidth becomes an enormous problem, and the fact that you're not just competing with stuff from this week. You're competing with stuff from the last 50 years now at this point, you know? Not really 50, because you know as well as I do that a lot of stuff just isn't available.
Right.
You know, but and we have a similar problem in comics too, that, you know, because of the rise of the trade paperback, it's the entire history of comics in my store right now. You know, and so if you're not as good as a book that came out 20 years ago, if you're not as good as Watchmen, why would I be pushing your comic? You know what I mean?
I also think that. Sorry, go ahead.
You know, go. It's fine.
I was just going to say, like, one thing that's, I think I've mentioned this to you before, but one thing that I found really interesting is, like, Marvel made a app-based experience so good that I've basically, I have bought one Marvel trade in probably the last 5 years, primarily because of Marvel Unlimited. There's very little reason for me to buy trades anymore because that product is so good. And like with Netflix, it's almost like a utility that I just don't think about, because it just is a bill on my credit card every month that I don't really think about, because it's like $9.99 or something like that. And so I can have like access to the entirety of Marvel's existence effectively for $9.99 a month instead of one trade, which will be probably not super well made for $20 to $25. And that's just that doesn't pencil out for me as a consumer. And
sure. Well, and it really depresses me that you've chosen to make that decision. I mean,
I'm sorry. I shouldn't have told you.
You know,
I do buy lots and lots and lots of comics, I promise you, but it's just Marvel.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. But what's about to happen is DC it just launched their streaming thing, and if that works at all, then we've got that to contend with too. I mean, it's all chipping away at the direct market and at the comic book store. It's almost as though they don't want to be in specialty stores anymore. You know, which is a decision. It's maybe not even an invalid decision. Maybe, yeah. But it's if I were making that decision, I'd be thinking really, 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 really hard about Birds in Hands and things like that. You know, because I do fundamentally believe that if the print market collapses, and it can for any number of reasons. Some of which may not have anything to do with Marvel or DC or stores.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not convinced that that Diamond's in a healthy place. For example,
interesting.
You know, I think that they've tried to make these forays into bookstores with Diamond Book Distributors, and they've lost all of their clients essentially. I look at how they've been ramping up production on Diamond Select toys. From what I hear, partly it was because of some commitments from Toys R Us, which Toys R Us closed and went away, and so those commitments all went away.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure what happens when Steve Geppi retires.
Right.
You know, because he's getting old. You know, I mean, I'm knocking wood that he's going to be with us, for quite some time to come, but. I don't know what happens then. You know, I think that the upper management team at Diamond is all pretty much getting near retirement age themselves.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Chuck Parker is not a name that anybody in the comics industry particularly talks about very much, but he might be one of the most important people, and he's again got to be within 5 or 6 years of retiring. He's got to be. What happens then? Who takes over? What's because Diamond certainly doesn't have any power to change things that are fundamentally harming their business. When you look at the way that brokered publishers are now increasing their SKU counts, like I looked at Dynamite the other day, and Dynamite solicited. I think it was the October subform. Maybe it was November. I don't know. But they solicited something like 106 different line items for like 15 or 17 individual titles.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, the average one of their books has 6 covers. And you look at their sales, and their best-selling book is like 15,000 copies.
Mm-hmm.
So Diamond is spending all of this operational energy distributing 1s and 2s to 10% of the stores, right? That takes time away from all the other things they're supposed to distribute. It all has this cascade effect, right?
Mm-hmm.
But they can't say no anymore because they've let their business develop to this place where, oh, you want to put 24 covers on your comic book? I guess we can't stop you.
Right. Yeah. It does. I use Comic List to see what's coming out each week, and it is kind of staggering sometimes seeing like just the going through like, oh, you're like, oh wow, that's a surprisingly large section for this publisher, and you're like, oh wait, there's actually only like 5 comics coming out. There's just a bunch of covers for each of them, and it is interesting seeing how that spread. Like some publishers don't do it that much. Like Dark Horse doesn't do it that much. Image doesn't do it super heavily, like and for the most part, from what I understand, I think their like AB covers are often open order, and so it's not like it's like they're doing gated or anything like that. But a lot of other publishers,
but even without the gating, you got to understand, even without the gating, it puts a stress on the system
right
that the system can't afford. I have to do final order cutoff every single week, right? It's gone from being 200 titles to being 300 to 350. That's an incredible increase in brain cycles and energy that I've got to put in, and I'm not making more money doing it.
Right.
Right? It would be one thing if we scaled up the number of SKUs and all the stores were selling more copies. Right? That would be good. That would be fine. But that's not what's happening to anyone that I'm aware of. I know that there are some stores that have offset the lack of sales on the, let's call it the A cover, with the speculators trying to get the B's and whatever, But I have not heard anyone going, oh no, we're dramatically increasing the number of comics that we were selling. Because it's hard to see how you could, and so, and then, in my position, I've got 2 stores, so I don't just have to go through that 350 item list once. I've got to go through it twice every fucking week.
Right.
And even if 80% of your choices are next, you still got to do that, and it cannot help but influence how you feel about the other comics. It's a bad situation, and it's not getting any better. And I don't see how it gets any better until the whole thing collapses. But then it's too late, so,
Yo, everybody. I want to take a second to talk about my friends over at Ahoy Comics. They're looking to shake up the publishing industry with a bold new format: comic book magazines. What are those? Comic book magazines will feature traditional, full-length comic stories, plus extra material like prose fiction from Grant Morrison, cartoons from Shannon Wheeler, and more. And Ahoy begins its second wave of comics with 2 titles. First is Captain Ginger, a 4-issue miniseries from Stuart Moore and June Brigman about a future where humanity has died out, but one gang of felines and their leader, Captain Ginger, struggle in a hostile universe after managing to escape the Earth. Also in October is a new 6-issue mature readers anthology miniseries, Edgar Allan Poe's Snifter of Terror, as creators like Mark Russell, Tom Payer, and Fred Harper tell stories that are a cross between drunk history and Tales from the Crypt. Look for those in October in comic shops everywhere. And now, let's get back to the show. Let's do, I just have a couple more questions, and I want to jump into Patreon questions. I'll make them pretty quick, but yep. I do want to ask about, you've written about the Comics Experience Outpost, your other store, and yep. the potential that you could possibly close it because your lease was coming up. What's your ultimate decision on that?
So the ultimate decision is I'm punting, and I signed a short-term lease or I'm about to sign a short-term lease to keep it open for another 3 years. And reassess. Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, and you probably could tell this from many of the things that I've said today, I no longer trust my partners.
Right.
I just don't trust Marvel and DC and Image and Dark Horse and almost all of them to do the right thing anymore. Mm-hmm. To publish things in a sane and rational way that's trying to grow the marketplace and make more money for all of us in the long run. I see nothing but short-term grabs. I see nothing but people losing respect and whether it's they're getting chased out of the market like you were talking about with Uncanny, mm-hmm. right? Where you're a diehard X-Men fan and you're not sure if you're going to buy that comic because you feel chased away. Or the other side of it, which you also said, which is you're not buying any Marvel comics anyway because you're just getting them on Marvel Unlimited, mm-hmm. right? So we're getting
no. I'm not buying Marvel trades. I'm buying single issues like crazy.
Okay. But my point is that you have changed your buying habits,
right,
as a result of actions that they have done, and you are a sophisticated customer. The less sophisticated customer is even more likely to actually just throw up their hands and go, "Yeah, I'm done." Mm-hmm. And it's not good. It is not good. That's why we're trying to move more towards selling kids comics and things like that, because at least I get that that's a growth market that could go someplace, Bibbidi bobbidi boo. Outpost I don't make any money off of Outpost, especially. I make a couple $100 profit a month. Considering the amount of work that I personally put in, it's probably not worth my time. But at the same token, it has, roughly an equal subscription customer base to comics that this store does, the main store does. It is the best store on that side of town, and I don't want to shut it down. I'm not interested in shutting down another comic book store in San Francisco. You know, when I opened in '89, there were nearly 30 of them, and now we have 9. You know, I don't want to be. When we only have 9, each one becomes precious. You know, and so as long as I'm not losing money, I guess I'm fine with it breaking even. But I wish that I had faith in my partners. I really do. And in a profound way, I'm not. Sometimes people are like, "Oh, Brian Hibbs, he's always so negative." It's not that. I'm clear-eyed about where my market is going and what my publishers are doing. And I don't feel like they have my best interests at heart anymore. I feel like they have corporate interests at heart. I think that they care about what's best for the Warner Corporation and for the Disney Corporation. And that's not what's best for comic book stores, for sure. And it's not what's best for the medium, for the creative part of the medium either.
Right. I mean, one thing to be said is also the fact that, like, you're actually, I'm not saying that they listen to you and they're making their decisions based off that, but I do think that you have a voice that they hear to a certain degree. And if you don't say that, then, like, no, they're not hearing it from anybody. So they think that everything is going great. So it's almost, I'm not putting a lot of pressure on you, but it's like, to a certain degree, like, you have, like, a responsibility as a major person to say these things so they see these things are being said. And I don't think complaining, or what you're saying, is necessarily complaining for complaining's sake. You're saying it because you want to see change. I do think that that's reflected in your decision to go with a short-term lease. It is, there is like a certain level of symmetry that you, instead of going with a long-term lease, you went with a short-term one, given the fact that all their short-term thinking is what's impacting you anyways. But I don't know. It's a very interesting place. But I want, before we get into the patron questions, I do want to ask, what is working? Like, what do you see, and what do you want to see more of coming up out of comics, besides, like, everyone changing their business practices overnight?
Yeah, well, like I said, I mean, what's working is kids comics.
Right.
Is working for the moment, at least. I mean, I don't, I can totally see that getting oversaturated in a year or two, and exploding, because that's always the history of everything. But yeah, kids comics are absolutely working right now. And, and I think that for my business individually, the 2 graphic novel clubs, hey, here's my plug to www.graphicnovelclub.com.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the fact that we've got, these 2 clubs that each have roughly 250 members, means that the books that we select, we're placing actually meaningful numbers for them, like to the point where, for smaller presses, like a Fan or a No Brow or something like that, we might have nearly every copy that they printed over the pre-orders. Mm-hmm. They thought they were printing a 2-year, 3-year supply, and I buy them all up just like that, because that's how books are. Mm-hmm. Again, not a thing that people think about, really. Most book print runs are really, really, really low. Really incredibly, insanely low. You would freak out if you realized how low they were.
Unless you're Dogman.
And yes, except for Dogman. Yeah. Which is incredibly fucking high.
Yeah.
500,000 copies or more on those books. Raina's new book's going to come out at 1 million copies, and every one of them is going to sell. Every single one of those copies is going to sell. I
read that the new Dogman was at 3 million on first order or first print.
Oh, maybe it is. That was off the top of my head.
Yeah. I mean, I actually think Raina. I think Guts is going to be huge, and I think Share Your Smile is going to. We might end up looking at that one as something that spawned a generation of new comic like creators or something like that, because it's all about showing how to tell your stories. But all right, so I'm gonna jump into some Patreon questions. I had a question from an Outpost customer who usually comes in on Tuesdays. Like, generally speaking, he finds that Tuesday is like kind of an interesting day because it's quite a bit quieter. Do you find, like, how I think you've even written about this to a degree, but how, like, I guess my question is like, each day of the week, obviously Wednesday's gonna be a huge day, weekends will probably be bigger, but do you find that some days are just like dead and some days are just slamming? Like, how does that work for day-to-day operations for you? Like, would you ever consider closing your store on a day that's like super dead or something?
Sure, and in fact, if you look broadly at comic shops across the country, you will see that many stores close on Mondays and Tuesdays, or Mondays or Tuesdays, or some variation thereof. Because business is so much slower on those days. There's definitely an ebb and peak through the week. It's funny because Tuesdays are kind of the day that we actually want people to not show up.
Because that's when your comics come in?
That's when the comics come in, and we're trying to focus all of our energy on counting them, pulling them, organizing them, doing the racks, taking other things off the racks. It's a lot of work. It's so much work. And so if you don't have people interrupting you and asking questions, then it goes a lot faster and a lot smoother. Having said that, though, you pay rent 7 days a week. It's not as though the landlord doesn't or charges you less rent because Mondays don't have very much business.
Right.
Right? So the problem is that the overwhelming majority of stores are literally single owner operated stores, where they might have one person who works there 1 or 2 days a week, but other than that, it's the owner is covering up basically all of the hours. That's the majority of stores. That's clearly the majority of stores here in San Francisco, even. And so it's difficult to be open 7 days a week under those circumstances when you have a slow day, and it's much easier to go, you know what, this will be the day that I catch up on work or sleep or have a life. Have I considered doing it? No. I mean, I haven't because, the great Jim Hanley once told me, you're there for the customers who show up, not for the ones who don't. And I always thought that was a really, really, really wise thing. And so Mondays are actually, our week typically goes in terms of from best to worst. It goes Saturday, Wednesday, Sunday are the three big days. Then it's Friday, Thursday, Monday, Tuesday, right? But Monday is actually a lot better than a Tuesday, specifically because that store over there and this store over here are both closed. My two closest stores, my two closest competitors don't open that day, so we get all the business that, and it's not a lot of business, but when you add it all together, it suddenly becomes meaningful.
Yeah. I do want to note that he actually specifically said that he does not want you to close on Tuesday. He's like, please don't let him do that. But he was curious about it.
Check. Yeah, no. I get it. It's, it's just, if you go into a comic shop and it's Tuesday and they're trying to get their new comics, ready, do try to stay out of their way. I'm not speaking to this specific person, but just as a general thing, that's the day that you want to be as minor of an inconvenience as you can, because your store is probably crazily, stupidly overworked that day.
Yeah.
It's a different kind of overwork than Wednesday, right? Because Wednesday is all about making people happy, right? It's I guess the difference for Santa between Christmas Day and Christmas Eve,
Right. So the next question I have from a patron is, obviously the idea of Wednesday Warriors is one that persists. And I know you've written about how it's obviously, if Saturday's your biggest day, it's not necessarily like Wednesday Warriors or everything for you. But do you find that your book or graphic novel customers have regularity or patterns that are predictable in the same way that Wednesday Warriors are? Or are they just all over the place?
Yeah, they're not weekly. So the answer to that is no, because you've got a lot of different motivations too in terms of regular graphic novel buyers. There's a class who literally buy Saga, and that's the thing that they buy as a graphic novel. And so you will see those people 2 or 3 times a year at most, because that's when they're coming in. There are people who buy graphic novels who come in, bi-weekly or every 3 weeks, but it's not predictable. It's not that kind of a heartbeat like the Wednesday Warrior is. Now, having said that, I honestly think that the Wednesday Warrior thing is entirely overstated. I did an actual analysis of our sales And at both stores, it appeared to me that roughly 1/3 of our customers who we can identify, in other words, not anonymous customers, right?
Right.
That people who have a name, and we attach our own names to people, even people who think they're anonymous. We sometimes track, so we know who's doing what. No, but I mean it's so that we can keep track of how do we order comics, right? So about 1/3 come in weekly. About 1/3 come in somewhere between like 5 and 12 weeks, and then the other third shop less frequently than every 12 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think that a lot of stores think about their customers in a non-rigorous way,
Mm-hmm.
that they have not actually done the analysis of what's going on, and they just take the evidence of their eyes as being the evidence. And when your store is filled on a Wednesday and you sell a lot of comics on a Wednesday, you can start to think, oh, this is the core of my business, right? Mm-hmm. But it turns out, at least for us, and again, this is at both locations, that there's a tremendous amount of business that's happening outside of that weekly corridor. And if you stock to that, then you end up selling more comics in the end,
Mm-hmm.
By having, at Outpost in particular, Outpost keeps the last basically year's worth of comics out on the shelf. It's like a single stack, right? So your newest issue of Amazing Spider-Man is in front, and then you can flip back and pick up all the
Mm-hmm.
earlier issues. We frequently, all the time, are selling comics that are 6, 8, 9 months old, and not in insignificant quantities, in like 10, 15, 20% of the initials.
Mm-hmm.
That's meaningful, and I think that a lot of the structure that we try to tell ourselves is how comics work, has been conflated for some of the wrong reasons. I totally get the idea that we're the only entertainment business that releases on Wednesday, therefore we own Wednesday, therefore we should be proud and push New Comics Day and New Comics Wednesday as a thing. But I also think that there's a lot more to how people buy, and that weekly purchases doesn't fit into most people's lives.
Yeah.
It's not how most people think about entertainment or buying things, or especially in this binge world that we live in now.
Yeah, I was going to say that too.
Yeah, so things are definitely changing. But no, to go back to the original question, I cannot specifically see an actionable pattern for the graphic novel customer, specifically because their motivations and the things that they buy are all over the map.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm a Wednesday warrior, but at the same time, and that's just because I've been reading forever, and like sometimes I don't make it in on Wednesday, but I do think it's interesting that some people believe in the Wednesday warrior paradigm, or that they think that that's just the way it always is, considering the fact that, like you said, we are in a time shifted time of life. Like in this period, it's like people they used to have like what is it, like the TGI, or the Thank God It's Thursday, or whatever the hell the old NBC sitcoms were in the 90s, Must See TV or whatever. That doesn't exist anymore. They have to report ratings with Live +3 or Live +7 now, because people don't watch things at the same time they did. Comics are no different. People don't operate in one paradigm. But speaking of that, the last question I want to ask is a doozy. I had a bunch of questions about the idea that comics could transition to trades or graphic novels first. Do you think that the American comic market could transition to a trades only, or almost like a Japanese manga style format only? Is that something that could happen, or do you see singles always having a place?
So, okay, there's a lot to unpack in that question. The first part is, and I think the most important question that we should ask is that actually desirable from a cash flow point of view, from a management point of view, from a production point of view? And I am not convinced in any way that is actually desirable to not have multiple revenue streams on a book and multiple options for people to buy it and multiple ways for people to buy it. I can surely say and fundamentally believe in a way that I don't even know that I can get across properly without going on for 20 minutes about it, that more people will buy a $3 or $4 periodical than will buy a $30 book.
Mm-hmm.
It's just how people think. It's how people shop. It's how people, if you don't know something about a graphic novel, those high prices get real scary real fast.
Right.
Whereas you can sample a whole lot of stuff if it's in the relatively inexpensive format of comics. That also provides cash flow. Even if your serialization isn't actually making money, it amortizes the cost of production. It keeps creators on the marketplace, active, visible in the marketplace. It keeps people producing work. One of my thoughts on this is, I was going to say example, but it's not actually an example. This is purely speculative. But I look at something like a Velvet Glove, Cast in Iron by Dan Clowes, which I think is one of the best comics of our century. It doesn't have an ending though, because he didn't know what to do, right? But he had to end it because it was being serialized in 8-ball, right? Mm-hmm. If he was only doing a graphic novel, he would never have finished it. It would never have been done. It would still be sitting in a drawer somewhere because he would have gone, no, it's not finished. I can't do it, I think there's a lot more work like that than we want to admit and that we want to talk about. I think that there are a lot of creators who do not have the ability to produce pages in a timely manner unless there is some sort of light lash on their back.
Mm-hmm.
And by that I mean just I've got a deadline. I've got my serialized deadline is now. I must do work.
Right.
I think there's a whole lot of people who wouldn't be producing half of what they do if it wasn't for those kind of deadlines. So that would be the first thing that I would ask. Is it actually desirable, this thing where we say graphic novels only?
Mm-hmm.
Second question is could we make that transition? I think the answer to that is yes, generally, because I've made that transition, right? Comics Experience used to be a back issue and periodical store when I opened,
Yeah.
That's what we were, just like every other comic shop in America. But I started seeing what graphic novels were and what the potential were, and we built that part of the business up to where it's now, essentially 2/3 of our commerce, is trades and books. I think that if periodical comics went away tomorrow, I would have a really hard year. Boy, would that be a hard year of adjustment. But I think I could get out the other side. I am not clear that my peers could do so because I don't think that they've laid the groundwork yet, right? And I don't think that they intellectually understand the way to do that. More importantly, I think that the overwhelming majority of comic shops in this country are not run by people who are in it because they believe in the medium itself. I think that the majority of people who own comic book stores in this country are people who believe in the genres, and specifically the subgenre of Marvel superhero comics and DC superhero comics.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that most of those people have the affinity to change their business model at this point, right? Or not just even the affinity, but the desire, right?
Right.
And the other part of it is, of course, is that an awful lot of my peers, and I'm not saying this to be negative, but are not particularly good business people,
mm-hmm.
right? They don't approach comics in a rigorous, analytical, how how do I make my store better in X, Y, and Z that are tangible things. They open their store and they run their store because they wanted to have a clubhouse that they could hang out in.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There's nothing wrong with that. There really is. That is a beautiful thing, and it kept comics alive for a really long time, and it's powerful and it's wonderful. But I don't know that a store that that whose whole raison d'etre is to sell. Well, let's look at Outpost before I bought it. Right? Gary, who was the previous owner, had a Spider-Man heart on.
Right.
He fucking loved Spider-Man. Man, did that guy love Spider-Man. Spider-Man, that's what he loved. It is all that he loved. Not all, but it was most of what he loved. And, when business started going down and it started becoming harder to sell Spider-Man, I think that a lot of his enthusiasm for it went away, which is why he decided that he was going to close it overnight instantly, And I fear that a lot of the stores out there are just like that. And I fear that if we get into a situation where something has to change at Diamond, I think that there could be major cataclysm. I have been told, though there's nothing that I could officially point to, on a piece of paper that says this anywhere, but I've been told that maybe as many as half of the stores are out of terms from Diamond,
Mm-hmm.
Or don't have terms, that are COD. So I think that it wouldn't take very, very much at all to knock the entire chain of dominoes down really fast. And I don't think that there's anyone at all anywhere who could step in and start distributing periodical comics from 0 to 60 that would come close to what Diamond is able to do. So I think we're living in a really, really precarious moment right now, which is one of the reasons, presumably, why the people in the biz dev suites at Marvel and or at Warner and Disney, maybe even more accurately, are looking at ways to try and get out of the direct market. I honestly think that's what this is. They can't tell us. There are people in Marvel and DC who are my friends, they're my pals, but they don't not lie to me.
Right.
Right. I can count on one hand the people who I know, if I ask them a question, I'm going to get the actual truth.
Mm-hmm.
There are, at every company, there are people, who are like that. But it's, we're in a precarious time right now. And I feel like there's a lot of forces that are arrayed against the direct market as it is constituted. And I think that the best thing my fellow retailers could do is to start changing their business models and start changing the way that they sell comics and they think of comics, they perceive comics, and to get themselves out of thinking that Marvel and DC are and will always be the center of it.
Yeah.
And because I don't think that that's true anymore. I just don't. Again, when we look at, you can watch 20 hours of it for free every single week on television, turn on the television, you can watch as much superheroes as a human being could possibly handle. And can you genuinely tell me that even a show that's as mediocre as Arrow is not, as good as most superhero comics that are being published?
Right.
I don't think that I would accept that argument, So it's a worrisome place to be in, but everything goes the way that it goes. I am optimistic. I am bullish. I am more bullish on comics now than I have ever been in the history of comics, because we are in a true golden age of creativity, of production. There are so many good comics coming out that even a guy like me who, lives, breathes, shits comics can't keep up anymore to the good stuff. Not even talking about the bad stuff. I can't even keep up with the good stuff anymore. That's a fantastic place for us to be in. And as I said at the top, the fact that the biggest area of growth right now is kids comics does nothing but bode well for the future. Comics in 2030, in 2040 are going to be mind-blowingly good.
Mm-hmm.
But will there be stores that are dedicated only to that? I mean, I hope mine still are here, and I suspect that every city has somewhere between 1 and 4 stores that could probably make the transition.
Mm-hmm.
But those are cities. I don't know that can happen in rural areas, and I certainly don't think that of the 9 comic shops that are in San Francisco today, that every single one of them can make the transition.
Yeah.
I'm in fact pretty positive that a lot of them won't. So this is it sounds like it's a really negative answer, but again, I am bullish on comics. I'm just down on the means of production right now, I guess.
Yeah. I think it's a very reasonable position to have, but I'm going to have, I like having these yearly chats because we get to see where everything progresses. But until next time, Brian, that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on and talking about all things comics and everything that's going on in retail. And best of luck with everything that's coming up.
My pleasure, David. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with comics retailer Brian Hibbs. You can find him in his San Francisco comic shop's Comics Experience and Comics Experience Outpost, as well as in Tilting at Windmills, his column at The Beat. If you're a fan of Off Panel, make sure to check it out on Patreon. If you back the show on there, you not only support the show, but you get early access to each week's podcast, access to exclusive written and audio content, and more. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the show on iTunes or Stitcher, and give the show a rating or review while you're at it. You can find the show on social media by liking the show on Facebook at /sketched, that's SKTCHD, following it on Twitter at @sketchcomic, or following me at @slicefriedgold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including TJ Dahl Lee, Dave Slusher, Kieran Marco Antonio, WMQ Comics, Akil, Greg Lockhart, Kokachi, Phil White, Ben Becker, Sean Pinello, Kent Heidelman, Philip Sevi, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, Nick Michelin, David Kelly, Robert Wilson IV, Nick Paletto, Dylan Campbell, Owen McCready, Brendan Fletcher, Gary Maloney, Jonathan Nilsson, Matthew Groom, Jason Massey, Mike Gillis, Adam Bogert, Xavier Files, Maria Schweitzer, Matthew Taylor, Tyler Turner, Dan Guarino, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Baraldi, Evan Blazer, Brian McRae, Ira James Udaskin, Henning Allers, Modern Magic Stories, Nick Hall, Bruno Batista, Bobby Angus, Bjorn Basin, John Hendrick, Steve Anderson, Phil Nall, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Benjamin Shipper, Carl McMahon, Chris Palmer, Maxwell Schmidt, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Kat McKenzie, Lou Avino, Nicholas Kesslake, Greg Rucka, Ryan Mail, Adam Heifel, Nicholas Gardner, Andrew Corrigan, Fiona Staples, Chris Morris, Chris O'Halloran, Mark Abnett, Mike Murphy, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim DiMonacos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics and Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to the band Wolfpack, whose excellent track outro from their album Volmilch opens and closes the show. Give them a listen as they're totally rad. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.